Thanks. So I think we're ready for our last panel. So thanks, Bart just introduced himself, but I have the privilege of, I guess while we're setting things up here, introducing our moderator for the last panel on Balkanization of the Internet. So our moderator for this panel is Bart Gellman, who to many of you needs no introduction. He has a long history with Princeton. Most recently, recently, you may be familiar with his coverage of the NSA for the Washington Post. But also, I think while some of us are racking up paper awards, Bart is racking up Pulitzer Prizes on many topics, including the September 11th attacks, as well as the surveillance state. He's also working on a book on this topic, and recently he also got an Emmy Award. So we're very, very privileged to have Bart not only today as our moderator for this last panel, but also as a fellow at CITP, thanks to the generosity of Microsoft. So for the next 2 years, we'll be very lucky to have Bart around as a fellow at CITP. So without further ado, please, Bart, welcome, and thanks for moderating this next panel.
I'll be Roger. It's kind of added everything.
Thanks, man.
Thank you very much. Seamless transition.
Who needs identifiers?
Oh yeah, thank you. So I'll start off. I'm going to try to keep out of the way of this amazing panel, and I won't do a long introduction, but from near to far, we've got Joe Hall, Chief Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And then comes Vern Paxson from Berkeley, who does networking and security. And we have Rob Faris, the research director at Berkman up at Harvard. And I think in that order, I'm going to ask you guys to just give a quick 5-minute intro on some work you've been doing in this field lately, and then we'll try to turn it into a conversation.
Sure. So I'll be real brief. The work I'm doing related to censorship, it's a relatively small part of what I do, but it involves working in technical standard setting bodies to build various types of resistance into core technical information architecture standards. And then the other thing is sort of working, I'm an advocate, I should say, at CDT, where we're out there to basically, make the case that you should do things a certain way. And the second part is specifically advocating for increased use of encryption just across the board. There's very few cases in which it's not a good thing to do. On the first part, there's a number of efforts increasingly at technical standard setting bodies, be it the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, the people who set the rules about the protocols that work on the networks we run, and the W3C, which you heard a little bit about with Wendy speaking and others, the World Wide Web Consortium that specifically talks about standards around web technologies, so the stuff that happens on port 80 and port 443 for the most part. And so some of this stuff, there's sort of two efforts at the IETF that I'll take some time to explain a little bit very briefly. One is a top-down effort from a part of the IETF called the IRTF, the Internet Research Task Force. That's called the Human Rights and Protocols Considerations Working Group. And here, there's a bunch of us that are trying to map engineering concepts onto human rights concepts. And it's pretty hard work, trying to sort of map what does it mean to have free expression into elements of network protocols and other kinds of technical things. And we could use some help. If you're interested, I can point you to places where we're actually, doing this right now. But something else I'm doing, and this is something that I'm more specifically funded by the MacArthur Foundation and that I work on quite a bit, is generating a series of internet drafts. An internet draft at the IETF is sort of the currency of argument, the things that you work on and that then end up memorializing certain decisions that get made. A series of internet drafts that are designed for protocol engineers if you care about things like censorship resistance, traffic analysis resistance, protocol fingerprinting resistance. So these are pretty technical kinds of things. Here's a document that describes all the things we know about how that's been accomplished in the past that you could use to design your technology to be more resistant to those things, and in some cases, outright avoid them. And so I have a draft. In fact, I'm going to be working on it a lot this next week, coming up to what's called the drafts deadline next Monday. And if you know of interesting ways people have censored stuff technically on the internet, I'd love to hear more about them. We may have already covered it, hopefully, if we did our job right, but if not, especially if there's really weird, obscure ones, I would love to know about that. And so on the second part, and then I'll shut up, properly designed end-to-end encryption is one of the most powerful tools against censorship in the middle of the network. It's also very powerful against things that aren't censorship. And when, as Roger mentioned, there's sort of, we conceptualize censorship as having three properties, and this isn't us, we probably cite to someone who said this that I don't remember at the moment, where we talk about aggregation, identification, and then execution. And so aggregation is deciding sort of what you want to block or impair. It's actually sort of the process of deciding what's bad. It's often sort of not a technical process, it's more of a political process. Identification is exactly what Roger was talking about. You have to do the surveillance part before you intervene and block or impair things. And then there's the execution, which is actually doing things like RST packet injection, selective filtering based on deep packet stuff. So things like server name indicator and TLS is a way that you can block things that say you don't want anyone going to falungong.github.com, but you're okay with kitties.github.com. There's ways to do that. And so we write a lot of things. For example, the ad industry is one that we're right now sort of on the heels of, in the sense that there's a lot of big web properties that the only reason they can't move to a fully encrypted website is because they're going to lose their revenue because they can't deterministically serve encrypted ads. So you can't even if you specify in mechanisms like in Google's ad products, I only want HTTPS served ads. Often you'll get ones that fly across that aren't for whatever reason, and then you get mixed content, which means you get a big nasty warning in your browser, or a not so big one in some browsers. Anyway, and so this is also related to work at the W3C around fingerprinting. A lot of technical folks have sort of considered fingerprinting, which is essentially using all the little features of your browser to uniquely identify you in some things like your font lists, which is not necessarily your browser, but it's part of your operating system that your browser exposes. A lot of people have considered fingerprinting to sort of be a lost cause and that we shouldn't do anything against it, whereas there's a number of us who feel that we shouldn't add any sort of surface area, so to speak, to fingerprinting. You shouldn't make it easier for people to do these kinds of things. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, actually, I'm going to amend my proposed order just to ask you to explain a little bit on what you just said. So when you're talking about mapping human rights values onto engineering standards, you're saying that there are features of the way that networks talk to each other, machines talk to each other, that can be hijacked, seized upon by people who want to do other surveillance or censorship. And I thought maybe it would help if you could give one example of that. There are people in this room who will understand this at a very low technical level, and there are people who would not. So maybe one translated example.
So I'll go with the one that's more difficult, which is what I had mentioned in passing, what's called server name indicator. So there used to be a time where we hosted all our websites on individual IP addresses. We're running out of IP addresses, and so now it's much more common to have one IP address host a number of websites. When you make an encrypted connection, when you try and start an encrypted connection to a given website where there's a bunch of them on a single IP address, you actually have to say, before you start any encrypted stuff, you have to say in the clear, hey, I need the certificate, I need the encryption information so I can talk to this guy in an encrypted way. I need that information for this given domain name. So you have to actually pass the domain name you want to reach in the clear. And that can be used by people on your network path to selectively either not allow that through, to send you what's called a RST packet, which basically tears down the connection before you even started talking. And that's why I was saying, these are ways you could conceivably block selectively for a large active site like GitHub, things like falungong.github.com versus kitties or whatever, something entirely unobjectionable.github.com.
Okay, thanks. Vern, why don't you take it up here?
Sure. So I'm a researcher. My group is very heavily empirically focused and opportunistic. So we look for things we can measure that are meaningful and that we can measure in sound ways. We have quite a bit going on in censorship circumvention research and including collaborations with folks here at Princeton and other institutes. One thing we look at is technical workings. So exactly how does the Great Firewall function in terms of a piece of network monitoring technology, or in Iran, what's going on with TLS interception or such. And part of that is to understand vulnerabilities in the monitoring process so that we can confuse it in various ways or circumvent it. This also led to us analyzing the Great Canon, which you heard earlier about sort of crossover from censorship monitoring technology into an offensive weapon, into denial of service. Another thrust is taking what we understand about these monitoring processes and working on circumvention technologies. So one student at Berkeley has one of the pluggable transports that Roger mentioned that is used for Tor, and we follow its usage, and we're very interested in the trajectory, the time constants associated with China in particular trying to thwart the use of this pluggable transport. We've done some work on how do citizenry respond to censorship.
Vern, could you mention a little bit what we talk about when you say time constants right there?
Yeah. So let me think how to frame this. We've long worked in network security and been aware of, in general in internet security, of arms races. These have long fascinated me. And an arms race, a key aspect of an arms race is what is the time constant? How long does it take for the attackers to change what they're doing? How long does it take for the defenders to counter it? And I could talk about that. In internet security context has had its own interesting evolution. But in particular for censorship, one notion we've been trying to think about is how do we quantify how good a circumvention system is? And one sort of term that we play with, I'm not sure it's really the right way to do it, is sort of integrated, useful circumvention that happens. So you would like to know if you have system A and system B, how much total usage will you get out of A or B before the censor blocks it? And so there are technical ways of thinking about that, like, well, A is easier to block than B. And then there are realistic ways, which is what really drives the censor's response? What is it that, soup to nuts, they have to put together in order to block some sort of circumvention technology? And there's various breadcrumbs of evidence that this is not simply a technical question at all. And it very conceivably depends in part on things like budget, your team, how sharp are they, what's their morale, do they care? We have one striking incident in Iran where it appears that the team had someone really sharp who did not care. And because they figured something out very clever, and then there was a natural, simple step after that, and they didn't do it for a year. And it could be just the hassles the censor faces in terms of, they got to roll out their technology, they got to test it, the ISPs don't like it, whatever. So we'd really like to understand that, because if we know what is it that most slows them down, then that's where we want to stick it. Anyway, so that's the general.
So one follow-up for you to start us off also. You mentioned in our conversation in advance of this talk that you have to figure out how you can do your research in an ethically responsible manner. I mean, what are the ethical questions when you're trying to measure censorship?
Right. So a big one goes back to the discussion in the earlier panel, in particular Roya and Alex talking about how do we measure at scale. And so we have these measurement techniques, one of them being Roya's technology and another that we've also worked on, where we can induce what appears to be a connection from some remote system in, call it A, in some country to some target outside the country, B, and we want to know, would that connection work? And the actual connection doesn't happen. We don't get A to actually connect to B. But if a sensor is watching, they will see what looks like there's a connection from A to B. And so with this technique, because you can generate such traffic at scale, we could, in principle, just aggressively map out the entire internet in terms of what is blocked from which A's to which B's, what's blocked. And we can't do it for fine-grained things like particular keywords in web searches, but we can know whether or not A can get to at least some website B in some country. Now, an ethical question here is, well, the sensor sees what appears to be a connection from A to B. And maybe that then implicates A, who did nothing. A is not even participating other than just running their computer. And
so by A, you're talking about someone with an actual unique IP address or?
Yes, right. So this is part of what we try to address in our ethics analysis. Can we find A's that it's going to be really hard to figure out that there's a single person associated with it? You know, so for example, some router in the middle of the network, that's not some user who's trying to connect to Facebook, right? So anyway, these are the sort of ethical questions, and comes to it brings up a couple, I think, key points. One of them is we technologists don't have a good understanding at all of what really are the risks that people face if they use circumvention technology, right? If some user in Iran tried to go to Facebook, is that going to get them in trouble? We don't know. You know, and it's really going to depend on the regime and on its monitoring capabilities, and in some ways how smart the monitors are, because our traffic, if you're technologically astute, you can look at it and go, oh, that's fake. So then if you cared about whether A really did go to the banned place, you would know in a technical sense. If you wanted an excuse to claim they had, then you've got it in the logs. And if you're thick, then you think they did, even though you're wrong. So all of that, we have no understanding how to model that part of it.
Well, so are you using the tool or not?
I'm sorry?
Are you using the tool? I mean, how have you resolved that dilemma?
Yeah, so yeah, we have used the tool on one instance of it, and we took steps as follows. First, we identified systems that are clearly not in systems, but are inside the network. And this goes to the point I was just making that arguably there is not a single person associated with them.
Well, does that mean, for example, you could trace it to this building?
Yeah, it would be like one of the
insured,
routers in this building, and that's exactly what it would be. It's essentially a router inside the network rather than an in system. Then we took that list and compared it with a list that is published of sort of net blocks associated with end users and made sure they weren't on that. And then when we do our query, this one happens to be DNS, where you're looking up a domain name. We send two queries. The first one says, this is research, go to this web page if you want to understand it. And then the second is the actual query that we think is the key one. So that's where our analysis took us. I think we're fairly comfortable with that in this particular instance, but I think we have this broader question of when we can make either apparent or actual third-party connections, how do we analyze the risks?
That sounds like a hard one. Rob?
Thanks so much. So we've talked a fair bit today about measuring censorship, about understanding and documenting it. Really good work. The Berkman Center has done a lot of work of that in the past, and we will do more of that in the future. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is understanding the impact of censorship itself, which is something we unfortunately don't understand that much about. So what is the impact of censorship on attenuating political, social, cultural, and economic activity on the internet? And one could even go farther than that and say, so what's the ultimate impact of that on human well-being? It's hard to study. I'm going to talk about two things we've done recently to try to begin to answer those questions. One of the related questions, of course, is what's the impact of circumvention tools on this? How do you gain back some of what's lost? And so the approach we've taken is to say, so the proof is in the pudding. Let's go see what it is that people do online and what they don't do online. And the way we've gone about this is using mapping of online spaces to do this. And I'm going to tell you about two studies mapping Twitter communities in Saudi Arabia and in China. If you were to do this for the United States, the map is going to be a bunch of clusters that are on conservative politics and liberal politics, and you'll have knitters and you'll have technology folks and law folks. We've done it for Egypt. What it looks like in Egypt is you have three political poles. You have the people who love Sisi, people who love the Muslim Brotherhood, the third way, people who don't like either one of those, and then kind of everybody else. If you do this in Iran, you have the pro-government, the opposition group, and you have a whole bunch of poetry and things. So we did this in Saudi Arabia, and so what we do is we collect a lot of accounts, many more details in how this is done than I can tell you today. But using social network tools, you cluster up these accounts based upon the relationships between the users, and it forms the structure of the online public sphere there, at least the part that's on Twitter, so that you can see which nodes are most prominent and what the topics are that kind of are used to form these communities form around. Saudi Arabia is particularly interesting because it's of course a heavily monitored and censored web space in Saudi Arabia, but apparently in 2013 when Twitter moved to HTTPS by default, the censorship mechanism no longer was able to selectively block individual Twitter accounts. So what we have there is we have a natural experiment in the removal of the technical filtering apparatus there. On a wildly popular tool, it's really the heart and soul of the network public sphere in Saudi Arabia. Facebook's important to do. The blogosphere died long ago, and everything's going on in Twitter there. And the technical filters are removed. All the rest of the controls are still there, so the different forms of surveillance are there. The social pressures are there, the trolls are there, everything else is there, just removing the technical filters, what you get. So we map those out, and the short answer to that is you get economics, you get politics, a whole lot of soccer, lots of soccer fans there. You have cooking, you have fashion, you name it, you have all these things. You also have political dissidents that are online. So they are linking to things that are blocked in the open web, but there they are, and they're embedded with the militants of the broader region there. And there they are, open out there for everyone on Twitter in Saudi Arabia to see. What you don't see is you don't see some of the communities you might, a kind of liberal progressive person might hope to see. There's no LGBT community, there's no women's rights cluster, there is no pro-democracy cluster. There's, whatever is going on, the conversation in Saudi Arabia is still constrained and shaped and formed by the traditional forces that are there. You see a little bit of pushback on political affairs. There's certainly more pushback than you would find in mainstream media, but it's modest. So you kind of have a hole in the networked public sphere there. Out on one extreme, you have extremist militant dissidents. You have acceptable speech over here and nothing in between. So very, very interesting.
Did you see?
Go ahead.
I was going to ask. Did you see evidence that the things they could do at scale to block content, they had to resort to retail physical intervention, like people getting arrested or something.
Oh, yeah, no, that's all there.
Okay, cool.
That's all there.
Interesting.
So
So
they're,
maybe some
they're,
shift of the
they are
tone.
very, very worried about Twitter there, and they're watching, and anyone who's tweeting things that are provocative in their own name are subject to attack by informal or informal means. So that's all there still.
So do you see, in the absence of overt conversation about forbidden subjects, that people are using elliptical or common cultural references, or you have any way of even measuring this, to talk about those things in a non-obvious way, the way that teenagers will use song lyrics on Facebook so their clueless parents don't know what they're saying?
So it's a great question. So what I should say is that in mapping these spaces, we chop off the long tail. And the focus of this is really what are the major topics of import in the public sphere. And this is all public utterances. So there are these conversations going on, but people are not following the people who are doing this, and they're not forming explicit public clusters around these issues. So it's not like they don't exist. I'm not claiming
You're relying on the follower followed.
That's right.
metrics,
That's right. That's right. And if people aren't following you to a significant extent, then you don't make the map. Let me just add on China very, very quickly. So we did the same thing in China, not Weibo, but Twitter in China, which it means that everybody in these networks had to use a circumvention tool to get there. And what we see is we see three topics. We see dissident politics, and we see entertainment, and we see technology, and that's what people are talking about. The dissidents are very strongly anti-government, pro-human rights. They're exactly who you think they are. And harking back to the conversation on anonymity earlier in the day, the standard is to be on Twitter and use your real name and say who you are and why you're doing what you're doing, which is very interesting.
So this is for any or all of you, looking at sort of at the 50,000 foot level and the broad struggle between offense and defense. If we think of offense as censorship and surveillance, can you give any example of where you're winning and where you're losing on that criteria?
Well, certainly encryption. I mean, the Snowden revelations have really kicked a bunch of people in the pants about getting better with that. I think there was a Sandvine report the other day that estimated 35% of volumetrically internet traffic. I mean, it's really hard for me to say that and with a straight face because it's whatever. It is encrypted, and they expect if Netflix flips the switch, then the volume will go up to 65 by the end of the. So I think that's a place where you're seeing inroads. Frankly, where I work at standards bodies, it's very hard to, you want to see more of that, but you're trying to push back against what I would call efforts to adorn traffic flows with additional metadata that may have now be lost inside the encrypted envelope, and there's a vocal minority. I mean, I wouldn't say minority. There's a pretty healthy pushback against that, but there's some very strong forces that really seem to want to do stuff in the middle of the network that requires that. So encryption is.
So actually, I wondered, and this is a related question, whether standards bodies are like most other large committees and therefore slow and have to work with least common denominators. And I wonder whether large private sector entities have actually more influence on this. So Google encrypted nearly all of its links by default. Then it started saying it was going to add points in search algorithms for encrypted sites. It said it was going to start to break unencrypted logon. It used to be that even when its own logon was HTTPS, it would allow unencrypted logons so that it wouldn't break, for example, Apple products at a certain point in time. They stopped doing that. So that has a big impact on what everybody else does. Is it a more fruitful place to work than the standards bodies?
So they all show up, and they definitely, that stuff that is sort of outside protocol definitions and stuff like that. But by all means, please go do that. But I think what you're highlighting is there's these power points that can really result in protection at scale. And another good example is the browser vendors. You know, both Chrome and Firefox are soon going to start marking unencrypted flows, HTTP without the S, as insecure in some manner. So you just like the little warnings you get when you visit a place that has broken encryption, you'll start to see that. So I think, you know, you're seeing a steady ratcheting up of that. So that's another example of a power relationship that is being leveraged by folks that are very much want to see more secure traffic on the internet. But yeah, I take your point. Yeah, it's the long tail is such that a few people doing a few things can result in huge gains, and they have.
Actually, one more on this, and I'm going to come to you guys. I wonder whether you have any way of measuring, and this is particularly germane, I think, to you at CDT, whether ordinary users are understanding the warnings they're getting or the tools that are available. I think it was Adam Langley at Google who tweeted a link to a conversation. It was sort of a how-to site. Somebody said, look, you know, my Chrome browser is broken. It won't go to the site because it's giving the warning of fake certificate. And then somebody does a how-to walkthrough so that you could override it, so that you could fix the bug in Chrome that is preventing you from going to this phishing site.
Well, there was that, and there was also the case, a similar Adam Langley post where he pointed to a bunch of users in schools where there was a filtering appliance that was blocking. Basically, they were really upset that Google was doing certain things with encryption because their filtering appliance couldn't block certain things, and now all their students were getting the whole internet all of a sudden and stuff like that. And so, yeah, we have a lot of work to do in user space, so to speak. That's going to be, it's hard, it takes a long time. A lot of it is, you know, when you think of sort of tech law, economics, and social norms, it's really going to be in sort of retail evangelism to other people. That's another big part of what I do is around digital hygiene. You know, what things do you need to do to stay safe, to sort of make sure that you're not going to get your identity stolen, but also for people that are more advanced, you know, or in more hostile adversarial regimes, what do you do in those cases? I don't have any really good answers there other than, you know, it's going to take a huge village to get to a point where people understand the trade-offs they're making if they do choose to exercise the controls that allow you to turn those things off.
So Vern, come back to this theme of offense, defense, if you would.
Yeah, well, I wanted to comment on a couple of these points.
Yeah, sure.
I think it is clear in security in general that users really struggle to understand information presented to them on their choices and the like, and therefore it's just crucial to design mechanisms that have apt safety properties given a user really can't, lacks a mental model that will allow them to assess what their risk is, even if it's just about attacks and certainly about privacy issues and the like. So I think that's really a big challenge. I also wanted to comment on, you know, the question came up about working with, say, the big companies and the like. One aspect of the whole offense-defense trade-off, you know, in my head, I don't know really where we are other than, to me, it feels like, yes, we're in an arms race. And so there's just no great answer for are we ahead or not. But it does seem to me, let me back up for a minute, in the history of internet attacks, if we're just talking about attacks, they have, over the last couple decades, risen in their sort of semantic level from being these low-level protocol things or exact programming problems to being more involving fooling users or leveraging complicated interactions between web services and so forth. And I think in the censorship space, something similar is going on, which is that some of the exciting circumvention technologies today essentially embed the circumvention inside a big web service, like content distribution networks or potentially social networks and so forth, and are upping the trade-off that a censor faces, which is, well, you can't tell whether or not this traffic is circumventing. I just have to block all of, say, Twitter, as you're saying, or allow it. And what that seems that's going to then lead to is an engagement which is not technical at all, but all about business and law, where I could picture, I don't know if this will happen, that of Saudi Arabia going to Twitter and saying, we need the following, by law, we need the following sorts of monitoring of what's going on with users from Saudi Arabia, and this is the club we will use if you don't do it. And a lot of that's going to boil down to what are those clubs and what does Twitter think of them and who needs who more and so forth. And so I think we're going to see that over the next few years where it's duked out at a completely non-technical level.
Rob.
I'll get a shot at it. So I think where we've won, or at least the censorship is lost, is trying to block information. People who want to learn about their world or find out certain things, blocking information is really, really hard, and it leaks through by any manner. I think we've also, some of us have overestimated the value of information alone as well, and that people in authoritarian countries know their governments are authoritarian. The folks in Turkey who are watching penguins knew there were protests in the streets. I mean, it's like those facts, you can't really block them. The thing which I think is more difficult, and I don't know how we win this one, is that for social capital to be built online using digital tools, the only models we know that have really worked for that is creating this social capital out in the open. And that's very, very fragile. So in an authoritarian country that wants to break up the organization of human beings who are organizing out in the open, I don't know what we do about that. It's a harder problem.
Is that because we can only study the open ones, or is it because we've even studied closed networks or ones that aren't publicly available for analysis, and we see social capital building failing there as well?
So I'd love to hear of examples of successful either closed communities that have changed their countries in a substantive way, or even anonymous communities. We can't really come up with them. The problem with closed communities is not to say that they don't have an impact, but their impact is necessarily limited by the fact that they're closed. The bigger you get, the more fragile you get.
So the closed community is the conspiracy.
Is it like the Illuminati? Exactly. I'm part of a number of groups that are very unpublic that I think we've changed things, but anyway.
So this is an interesting idea. You're saying that the authoritarian regimes can tolerate information leaks as long as they can prevent the aggregation of people, of networks, of communities from working together and to organize and to realize their power as masses.
That's right. They block information where information leads to collective action. It's not to say they don't block things that they're annoyed by. They certainly do that, and they do block things that there's, the political or the social norms allow them to do so. But the things you really need to block are the things that are going to cause you trouble. But when you get to that stage, it's very, very easy to figure out who the troublemakers are and pick them out of the network.
I mean, do you imagine a systemic or a technical answer that would enable a community to form in which the members know one another, but the government can't track them? I mean, is that even a plausible project?
I don't know.
It seems really hard given moles and the fact that once you're any size, you will have moles inside.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you overcome that.
Right. Why don't I bring it to the floor? I'll maybe intervene myself now and then. Go ahead.
Actually, this isn't my question, but I think revolutionary parties with a cell-based organization are all about trying to be secret, and occasionally they're successful in having revolutions. So it is a known challenge. Secret organizations that engage in revolutionary activity, they do exist historically, and they use a particular organizational model to achieve that. My question, Vern.
So that's a mole reduction.
What's that?
That's a mole reduction.
Or mole isolation.
Mole isolation.
So you have the interesting problem of trying to slow down. You initiating circumvention, as I understand it, and you want the response to be as slow as possible so the circumvention works.
The
That's
adaptation
a
to it,
crude
yeah.
summary, all right? So I find that really interesting because I'll tell you what really slows down responses. It's not that they can't figure out the technology, it's often bureaucracy. You know, you're dealing with bureaucracy, right? There's a large field on the study of bureaucracy, which is about bureaucratic dysfunction and how terrible it is because things are so damn slow and it's hard to get things done. And there, the research question is usually, how can we make bureaucracies respond faster?
Yeah.
But your
Not how
problem
to
is
leverage.
interestingly standing that on its
Right.
head
Right.
to study a bureaucracy and formulate a strategy that plays to the weaknesses and the dysfunctions of
Exactly.
the bureaucracies. That's a really interesting
Let's do
Hey,
it.
one
kind of
thing I would
novel
add,
question of bureaucratic strategy and kind of
it seems it would be so helpful to have a few defectors who worked in these and know how they function, because it seems one difficulty with them, maybe I'm wrong, which would be great, is just getting illumination of how the bureaucracy works.
I mean, some of it's pretty, if you want the American government to go slow, require state to federal coordination. It's gonna be a disaster, right? Or you get, I've studied the Department of Transportation, it's got highways here, it's got safety there, it's got transit there. If you come up with a strategy that requires highways to coordinate with transit, it's gonna be slow.
Or international
So some of
treaties.
this stuff is actually, you can do some pretty crude analysis of institutions and look where they have poor coordination mechanisms and then design a strategy that requires exactly that coordination, and you may find that it's a very slow response.
Or develop institutional exploits to increase the time constants in the bureaucratic mechanisms. I don't know who does that, but
So,
CIA, anyway.
but it's an interesting mapping. It's a little bit, you know, Joe, you're mapping human rights onto technical standards, and you'd be sort of mapping bureaucratic and institutional forms onto system design.
Yeah.
Certain
Artifacts.
It's actually quite, there's another interesting parallel, which is, I mean, it's standard US military doctrine now that you want to work at a speed and with a sufficient number of distributed challenges to the opponent that you're inside their decision cycle, that by the time they're reacting to one thing, you're already doing something else.
Not really questions at all.
Yeah.
In the back, please.
So I
Uh-huh.
have this, a lot of times, forcing the governments to shut it all down or not seems to be the best. But I'm not talking about China. China's a very special case. They have their homegrown stuff. But the rest of the world, they're using what Americans are using for the most part. And if it's HTTPS, it's hard for the government to URL block. So they get into this cat and mouse game of you obey our rules or we shut you all down, and it becomes a question of how popular the thing is. I don't think Saudi Arabia can shut down Twitter at this point either. There'd be a huge political cost and all that. So this brings me to my, pet peeve is that why don't we focus more on the U.S. behavior? It's kind of like the way U.S. copyright law is eating the world, which kind of sucks. Whatever we can make them do domestically really, really helps abroad. Because it's hard for us here to influence, say, the Russian or Turkish governments to behave better or something like that. But we can influence Facebook to go HTTPS or be better or be this and be that. And there's been great success in that regard in getting.
So what would be a couple of targets of opportunity?
One of the things is to force the things that we would protect U.S. consumers from mass surveillance. I think everything we do on that regard, I mean, if I were a U.S. NGO and I wanted to help Turkish citizens, I would focus on lobbying, pressuring, regulating, I don't know, whatever you could throw at it to protect U.S. consumers. I wouldn't utter a word of Turkey. In fact, it almost backfires because of NSA stuff. There's so much re-territorialization of the internet because it's now seen as a stupid U.S. government, blah, blah, blah. But it sometimes almost hurts when we go out and say, let us help Turkish government, and then the Turkish government like the American thing. Whereas if we help the American public protect itself from mass surveillance, we are.
Right, but I mean, well, maybe I'll ask the panel to address this now. So, as far as I can recall, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, all now are secure connections by default.
With
what
perfect
else?
forward secrecy, so keys
With forward
that
secrecy.
change per connection.
Right, so that
Effort to
so-
get them to do that.
Yeah, it's not easy.
took quite a lot of effort to get them to.
Those efforts really pay off for everybody else, without also giving political talking points to everybody else.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
feel like, can we just talk about ourselves more, also as a way of.
Right. So I'd ask you to address Dave's question. What's the next step? They're already doing the HTTPS, the forward secrecy.
It's
What
not very,
next?
it's kind of depressing. So DNS is a wreck. I was going to talk about DNS and BGP, but Paul, you
Well, I was just going to say that, you brought up Facebook. So Facebook is now, has a .onion address, which
Yeah.
they are encouraging their users to go to because there's so many Tor users. What that means is you cannot be subject to a DNS observation or hijack because you never leave the Tor network. You never leave the Tor protocol and go to Facebook at all. So
more services on .onion domain. Woo!
right, and that's now, which is now an IETF reserved domain,
Yes.
so there's been progress there too. But the point is, Facebook is doing this to improve the user experience of all their Tor users, and also it's making them more secure. It's harder for somebody to observe connections to Facebook.
That's a really good point. Yeah, what I was going to drone on about is that it's very hard to secure DNS, let alone make it private and confidential. And every time you connect someplace, you do make a DNS connection to do that unless you happen to visit a place that only has an IP address for whatever reason. BGP, or .onion address. BGP, which is this thing that maybe not, definitely people in the room know what I'm talking about, but there's probably people in the room who are like, I don't know what the hell that is. These are essentially how networks tell, hey, go this way to get closer to that place on the internet. It's a very toy way of explaining it. Not only is it unauthenticated and not secure, but there's these really deep sort of problems with making it secure in terms of dependencies that people like Sharon Goldberg have pointed out. Nick seems like he has something he wants.
The one problem is, though, is just in general, unless you're using a system like Tor where you have multiple relays, you are going to, on current protocols, have who talks to who level of
Yeah.
service metadata. And with TLS, you'll also have SNI and all that.
And you may have other things that we're trying not to. We want to have everything in the encrypted envelope, but SNI is currently outside.
Yeah. And so, but even if SNI goes inside the encrypted envelope, except for some CDN domains, you're probably still going to know what host name or at least what service descriptor you're connecting to. So the question is, do we really want to fight that fight when just wrapping the user ID stuff in the TLS and stopping all the web tracking gets us 90% of the way there for the easy effort.
And there are efforts like NDN and XIA, these are things you can look up that are sort of the next generation internet stuff, but I don't think they do any of that. They do some of that, like NDN is very resistant to traffic analysis in some setups. But so maybe the answer in some sense is we need to build a new internet that sort of builds this stuff in, but that makes a lot of technical people sad because it's been hard enough to fix the one we got.
Just one thing I think we should keep in mind is that even with our crypto technology, it is anchored in points of trust. And there will be potentially very big struggles over who decides what are those anchors. And there are technical means to insist on particular anchors, and then there are technical means to say, well, you don't get to insist on that because by state law, that's not allowed. You have to support police surveillance or whatever. So I think that even with all this technology, those struggles will still face us.
So I totally agree with Zeynep. I think that focusing on the tools that people use and shoring those up to the best of our ability is the place to start. There's lots to be done, obviously, but I also think that what Twitter is doing right now to enable public speech in Saudi Arabia, I think it's pretty awesome. And I don't know, I think they ought to be commended on that. Facebook needs to go a step farther on its real name policy to get up to par with Twitter, and I think they'll come around on that eventually, but they could do
Could you
that.
describe how those two change? I just don't know what you're talking about.
What?
In terms of what Saudi Arabia is doing.
No, it's
or
not
Twitter's
what
doing
Saudi
and
Arabia is
Arabia's
doing. So
that
Twitter,
Facebook
by
isn't
moving
doing.
to encryption by default,
Okay.
has effectively shut down the selective blocking of accounts there.
But it was not a decision on their part vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, right?
No, it
just a
wasn't. It was
decision-
just doing the right thing and shoring up the infrastructure that people use on a day-to-day basis.
And so
there
Facebook
are
is also
tens and tens of
encrypted by
thousands of
default, and
people.
that's what I'm wondering, how does the real name, Twitter allows you to not have a real name, or?
Yeah, you can,
Okay,
be,
and
you
whereas
can be
Facebook is-
pseudonymous on Twitter and not have your,
And
your
Facebook not so
account
much?
taken down because you're
Yeah.
pseudonymous.
Aha, yes.
If you are on Facebook and you're a high-risk individual, you can have your account taken down by people flagging your account as being not under your real name. And
By the way, I would.
that's a problem.
I happened to talk with Facebook's CSO, and he commented that Facebook will flag activist accounts to internally protect. So
They're doing better. They're doing
They
better.
actually
They
have it.
still
yeah,
have a
in
ways
their-
to go.
in
Yeah.
There's
their
been
database.
recent pressure on that, like this past week, a bunch of us sent a letter to Facebook
Yeah,
saying,
yeah.
I think you were involved, as a matter of fact, saying, please, do better with your real name policy.
Yeah, yeah. No, the slope of the curve is in the right direction there.
Is there one, oh, actually, Nick, how much time do we have? 10 more minutes? 15? All right, I'll go back to the,
Hi, how you doing? I just want to go back to that point that.
nice and loud, please.
Sorry?
Nice and loud.
Okay, I just want to go back to that point that turning off full encryption actually helps access to information platforms in many countries in the world. I don't think that's the case actually, particularly in Iran. That the reason that these sites are encrypted and that the government can't block selective content, they just block the entire content. Where you can see that countries like Turkey comply with Facebook and Twitter take selective content offline so people don't have access to it. And I don't think by just regulating these companies in the US, we actually help users across the world, because these countries will only be basically susceptible to these laws in the US. The US government can't enforce the Turkish government by the US regulations that it's not Twitter or other companies. So I don't see how regulating these companies in the US or turning encryption on to actually help access to information. But we clearly see that it is hindering access.
And so the point being that even evangelizing encryption to US-based services that are highly used in the rest of the world, that doesn't get you very far in certain places that just block or degrade to the point of unutility certain encrypted flows. Right? That's what you're saying? Sure.
The point is, there's no solution to that. If
Yeah.
you're gonna block Twitter, you don't have an answer that basically solves the circumvention test. What I'm saying is, for a lot of places, they're not gonna block Twitter, they're not gonna block Facebook, so there we wanna protect people. For the places that are blocking it, that was my wish list, was make VPNs fast and make circumvention tools as normalized as possible.
Well, I wonder if there's also, like some of the stuff that I know Alex Halderman has done and others have done in steganographic tools, so things that hide information in unencrypted flows. But the problem there is, it's very hard to obfuscate things in a way that very, very smart people can't unobfuscate them.
So let me briefly add, because this is one of our pet things right now, is, and we hope to have a paper on this by next month. What you just said, we hear a lot among people doing research on circumvention systems, and yet we, my group, and colleagues feel like there is a definite disconnect between academia, which can look at these schemes and think, there's a subtle little thing that if the censor just will do, 1 million computations over such and such, they'll be able to tell, versus how the censors actually work. And we've cataloged known blocking events that we can find, and we've cataloged the literature, and the intersection between them is modest. So literature, the academic work tends to focus on things that real-world censors don't appear even close to being interested in doing in practice. So that makes this a harder question. And I do think, when you raise the point about, if there's no hope if the regime's willing to block the service, actually I think there is quite a bit of hope in terms of circumvention technology that in practice is going to be pretty hard for the censor to block. And there's completely separate questions about usability and user safety and so forth, which are also hard and important there.
Cool. Wasn't that an itty bitty paper at like Hot Pets that now you're going to turn into something big?
Well, yeah, we distilled that out of our draft work at the time. Yes.
Cool.
So I just want to follow up on that. I think that that's all true and right, but once we move into a world where only people using circumvention tools are gaining access to these platforms and tools, then we're taking the public discourse space and we're shrinking it down into something that's tiny.
It's an excellent point.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. So when we look at China, there's 10,000 people on Twitter. And when you look at Saudi Arabia, there's hundreds of thousands of people. And so it's very different. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that today we know the answer to this, which is that China will block anything it needs to and wants to, and Iran will do the same thing. And for everyone else in the world, including Vietnam and a whole host of other countries that would love to be in China's place, which is to have its own alternative social networking tools that it could regulate domestically, it would very, very happily do so and block YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, but it's not in the position to do so. In 5 or 10 years, I don't know if that answer is going to stay the same necessarily, and I think endlessly bundling more and more things all under single platforms, which raise the costs and benefits of blocking the entire thing, I'm not sure it's always the right strategy.
How are people, ordinary users, getting copies of the circumvention technology? I mean, it reminds me a little bit of a problem I have as a journalist sometimes. How do you make first contact with someone before you can set up more secure ways of talking in a situation in which any contact is noted, say, in a leak investigation? So how do you download the Tor browser? How do you
we may be
start
the
your work?
wrong three people. There's tons
Ask
of people.
Roger.
Hey, Roger, for example, would know the answer to that, but I
I
suspect
think I know
it's
the
very hard.
answer.
Oh,
Great. The answer is you use whatever your friends are using. You ask your friends. And they might be using the best tools and they may not. The other thing is you Google it. And
It's like
may
literally
or-
social Darwinism.
you may or may not get the right answer. Yeah. But if your friends are technically sophisticated and tapped in, then you'll end up using Tor. And if not, you're using some random proxy and you have no idea who's on the other end of it.
Yeah.
I think that suggests that one thing we need to focus on tools is the way to do peer-to-peer exchange. That SumIs.style has the tapes around, all that has worked throughout history as being the way that people communicate under repressive regimes. And our tools should have that same property.
The word you're looking for is samizdatta.
I have no clue how to go towards that light, but it sounds awesome.
There are a lot of efforts to summarize the costs and benefits of different tools that are out there and spread that out. So people are doing that work, but it's a hard kind of networking problem to figure out how to reach everybody with that information.
All right, so Vern, you were just talking about the relative unsophistication technically of a lot of the censors. There's something they could be doing, but they're not. And I'm wondering whether there's a growing arbitrage function happening now in which companies like Hacking Team or Gamma are saying, well, just contract it out to us. We actually are staying on top of the research and we can do it for you.
So I actually think of it differently than that. So I don't think it's that they couldn't build it. I think it's that they don't see a need for it. And it's because of a couple things. One is, at least in my head, I model a lot of censorship is about the chill and not the airtight censorship. So it's okay if it doesn't always work. Another part, though, is that I think the academic work tends to assume a tolerance for for false positives that my guess is the censors don't like. They actually don't want to block stuff incorrectly because that pisses off somebody, and one day it's going to be some minister, and it's going to be a huge headache. And so that's just speculation on our part. But when we look at in practice, empirically, what's the taste for censors for overblocking? It has been pretty low compared to what academic work implicitly assumes.
Up front, Nick?
A question about, and there's a question earlier, and then even in the first panel about people using circumvention technologies and then not using them. And I think some of this relates to usability. Right? So if the tool isn't that usable, then they'll only use it when they need to circumvent. And I'm wondering, there hasn't been that much discussion about usability, but I'm wondering about if anyone can speak to that, and maybe even Faris, like, anyone has opinions or experience with, how do you reason about how safe you are if you're only using this at certain times and then other times you're not? And is that a problem? Because if a tool's not usable and I only use it when I absolutely have to need it,
Yeah.
does that create problems?
I suspect, like, I have a staff technologist, Greg Norsey, whose PhD thesis is made up of a bunch of usability studies of Tor. I mean, a few chunks of it are. And the whole impetus behind that is that, we understand from our friends at Tor that one frustrating experience can be the defection from using the tool, or the frustration with the tool, or the not using as much as you could. And so I think they really prioritize designing in not just usability. Like the Tor browser right now is just freaking gorgeous. Like, I mean, compared to what it was like 5 years ago, it was like, now it's not a bunch of different things. It's one thing. It has like really cool sliders for people like me who want to block JavaScript and third-party requests and stuff like that, but most people don't. But I think it's even on, finding ways to deal with latency, for example, which is often a frustration. Oh, geez, this thing is sitting here going, and I really just want access to the stuff. There's a user study my technologist did that he's writing up right now that is all about basically the latency problem, and are there things we could surface in the interface itself to say, hey, the estimated time on Tor right now is this long. Hopefully it's not a progress bar because we stare at those too much. It's something that teaches you something like a Snapple bottle cap or something. But anyway, I'll shut up. But as a first-hand operational, very important user.
And there's a new congestion management algorithm in the works that
Ooh.
will improve things quite a bit.
Damn, I didn't know that. That is really cool. Where do I learn about that, Paul?
In the paper we wrote, it was in Usenet Security a year ago.
Okay, so I'm just behind. Cool.
But it's in the process of
Being implemented.
being able, I don't know, is it in an alpha yet, or it's on this?
Well, yeah.
Next Tuesday.
I mean, it's a statement of the obvious that if it takes technical proficiency, then it's going to be hard to get people to use it, and if it's super inconvenient, it's hard to get people to use it. I mean, in one of my other lives, I've tried to encourage fellow journalists in a newsroom to use encryption technology or Tor or other things, and it's very hard, I mean, especially when sort of with the state of, say, PGP mail encryption circa 2012. Maybe there were 2 people I could talk into using it ever, but these days, there are people making a lot of progress on it. So, Moxie's got open whisper systems, and Signal or TextSecure are a lot better than the alternatives were. I've actually recently gone through an exercise to see, is there a way I can use that and have anonymity at the same time, which is not built into it. And it's really, really complicated and hard. I think it might be doable, but I mean, if you want to be able to give people tools that'll do that sort of thing, you've got to make it a lot easier. You've got to spell it out, or you've got to build it in. I mean, Moxie actually said something in a blog post that interested me a lot. He said that from his point of view, in terms of system design, there are no power users. Half the time, if you give people a lot of extra controls, they'll just screw it up. More than half the time, he thinks. So just make it completely transparent to the user, make it do what it's supposed to do. and you know, that's a much better tool. But there are a lot of people for whom openness, ease of contact, you know, I could get this done quickly, I could be found easily, is paramount. And so if you tell, say, a journalist, you want to make it harder to figure out who you are, and you want to make it slower to start up your workday and slower to work with, you know, with your confidential notes to write the story on a deadline, it's not going to fly.
Jeanette Wing said user error isn't an explanation, it's a diagnosis.
Right.
I just want to ask about what the panelists think is a better way to improve the relationship between research and practice in the kind of situation that you're talking about. I know, for example, the standards work, academics don't touch it, it doesn't publish well. You know, a lot of the work in, let's say, PETS is lovely with respect to output of research results, but once you have to code it, then we have the problem that Lorenzo was talking about earlier. It's like 3 years of coding. It's really bad for your PhD students. It's very bad for your funders. What we try to do is like do a workshop on privacy engineering so that people can publish on the act of like engineering these tools as a kind of scientific thing in itself. But what other things can we do to make sure that, you know, the problem I think with usability partially comes because we're like so disciplined in computer science. The usability is another department, right?
Yeah.
And like when we put these tools in the world, this kind of Frankenstein has to be built up with like putting these disciplines together which are actually separated by institution. These are just some ideas I wonder if you have for you.
I mean, one thing I'll comment is that, you know, for many, many researchers, what really is important is what is the funder going to encourage you to do? And, or at least, what's the envelope they'll allow? And I know for another project of mine, which is ironically about network monitoring for to detect things, the key in transitioning it to now having really a lot of impact in the real world was the National Science Foundation being willing to fund exactly that. And it was still hard because you don't get your PhD students and so forth to work on it because it's going to be difficult to sell. I think that this is challenging. I think the workshop notion you just framed, that's good, that helps. I think one thing in this particular space that can be leveraged is I am struck at the passion of the students who go after it. It's different than any other, except I have a student who works on surveillance, and that's the same. And so that, if those students can actually see this path to real world effect, which will involve sort of organizations who are more able to do so to facilitate, like for example, the Tor project's been great in terms of, you know, engagement with students who work on Tor. That's one way forward in that regard. I don't know beyond that. And this is just an ongoing structural problem with research versus tech transfer.
Well, and I have very few good answers there. One that I would say is that I think showing people that you can make a living working on that stuff is important. So that's like why, you know, look, I have a job at an NGO, and we don't write code because there's not enough of us, but there are plenty that do. Like the EFF maintains a few browser extensions, and if you've ever maintained a browser extension, that really sucks. And you'd rather just write the paper and let it sit there and hope someone works on it, and if it doesn't, who cares? And that happens all the time. And so a part of it is this pipelining thing that, you know, there's academia, there's industry, and there's a whole bunch in between. There's you know, work at industry research institutions, there's work at government, there's work at NGOs. Like we have a lot of funding pointing at us saying, hey, can you do exactly what you just said right there? Are there ways that you can sort of solve these problems? And so I think the funding is there. I hope that they're also available to folks like Vern and others who might, you know, not just want NSF funding, but, you know, MacArthur Foundation Citizen Lab, for example, is a good example. A lot of that stuff is funded by Eric Sears at MacArthur. Anyway, and so this is really hard, and I'm glad you're thinking about it, and I'll help think about it. But
And that's going to be the last word. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, it's great to hear.
I guess before people leave, I think it's appropriate to thank not only our panelists today, our moderator Bart here in the last panel as well, but also some of the other folks who've made this event go off so smoothly. So I'd like to thank Joanna, our Associate Director. And also Laura, who's really helped us make everything quite smooth. And so thanks very much. And I'll remind you, too, that a lot of folks that you saw today actually are fellows in the center. So if this topic is something where you want to continue conversations, this is a good place for it. So thanks.